Hey creeps, it's Horror Free For All. Not too long ago, I made a goal for myself, and that goal was to experience every single thing horror anthology related that George Romero was ever tied to. And I powered my way through Tales from the Dark Side, and I experienced everything that franchise has to offer, from the TV show to the movie to even the fabled stories that were going to be in the sequel movie and the failed Joe Hill spin-off stories. I made my way through the Monsters TV show, which had no spin-off material associated with it, but it was essentially a spiritual successor to Tales from the Dark Side. But most importantly, I've been powering my way through Creepshow, which was essentially the founding father of both of those properties. And this was by far my favorite George Romero horror anthology property ever made. And at this point, I'm down to the last thing I need to experience for the franchise up until this point to have experienced everything for the whole franchise. So I got to a point where I'm like, I could end it here and end it off on a high note, or I can keep pushing forward and go into these two movies that I've known about since at least 2009, when I first saw the first movie in this set of two films at my local Blockbuster as a rental. And I avoided the movie like it was the plague because it reminded me of a movie that I absolutely hated from 2006 called Creepshow 3. And I remember seeing the front and the back of this particular film we're going to be discussing today in this video and saying out loud, this looks like Creepshow 3 Part 2. So I put it down and I never checked it out, nor its follow up. And I've put it off for so long that I feel like I have no other options but to finally get into discussing these. And I thought that this would be a fun way to springboard these movies into a series that I've been dying to get back into. And it's called Discovering Anthology. Now, Discovering Anthology is a series that I look at horror anthology films for the first time, or these are films that I've seen in the past that I just have a lot to say about, or maybe just a movie that I think deserves more recognition, whatever the case may be. And I talk about the movies and the people or the talent involved in terms of the writing, the acting, and what have you, the stories themselves, what they offer to the horror anthology subgenre as a whole, either as individual segments or as a packaged film altogether, and my likelihood to recommend the movies to you all to go watch. Now, this film in particular came out in the year 2009, and it's called Deadtime Stories Volume 1, or better known as George Romero's Deadtime Stories Volume 1. Now, back to my Creepshow 3 story I shared here. Creepshow 3, in my opinion, is the worst horror sequel ever made. And to get into the backstory without getting into the thick of it all, essentially George Romero was approached by two small time writers that never really had experience in making films, and they asked to buy the film rights to some George Romero properties. And George Romero essentially allowed them to buy up film rights for franchises such as Day of the Dead and Creepshow, and completely ruined them and tarnished any sort of ability to ever bring these franchises back to film. Maybe minus Creepshow to an extent, but for Day of the Dead, good God Almighty, they fucking ruined that series. But going back to my hatred of Creepshow 3, I felt was like a slam piece movie against the legacy of George Romero and Stephen King, and against all the talented people that worked in Laurel Productions and were a part of Creepshow, Tales from the Dark Side, and Monsters, and just spat in their faces like they were a bunch of jokes. And there's a lot to hate on it, just an individual basis of what Creepshow 3 brings to the table, but that factor alone makes it my most hated horror movie of all time. So, when we get movies like Deadtime Stories here, which, if you're not familiar with Deadtime Stories and the name usage of that, Deadtime Stories is, I guess, a popular title for horror movies, especially anthologies out there. We're not talking about the 1980s standalone horror anthology movie, but at some point on this playlist, you might see me bring that one up. So stay tuned for that in the future. And we're not talking about the Goosebumps knockoff kids horror series from the 90s that later would spawn a TV show on Nickelodeon. No, we're not talking about those. We're talking about George Romero's Deadtime stories. And from the backstory of it all, I gathered that George Romero was approached by these two guys, Jeff Monahan and Antoine Dagan, or Pagan, I think that's his name. And these two had written some stories that they thought would be really cool and anthological horror, but they needed, I guess, some funding in a production company or maybe a producer to find a financial backing to get these stories made into film. So they approached George Romero, and these guys supposedly had a working relationship with George Romero at one point or another. I know Jeff Monahan, who I guess is the main contributor and creator behind this movie, worked with him on two other films that George Romero did in his, I guess, peak of his career. I know one in particular is Two Evil Eyes, which is a very popular horror anthology film out there. So on paper, this doesn't sound like a bad idea, right? And when you look at some more people involved, we have people like Michael Fisher, who is another director associated with this movie here, who directed a film called Death Spa back in the 1980s, which I vaguely remember catching some snippets on a compilation video of somebody who made the best, worst horror films ever made. And it looks so batshit and crazy, but not terrible. And I remember they brought up an aspect of Michael Fisher and how just crazy this guy is. So seeing him attached to this got me hyped. And then, of course, seeing Tom Savini as a co-director of this film blew my mind, because Tom Savini, he's been a part of some of my favorite horror films ever made, and he's such a prolific prosthetic and makeup and gore effects person in the horror movie making circuit that he's pretty much like the founding father, maybe next to two other people, of what we expect out of gore and horror movies. And Tom Savini also lended his hand in acting roles in iconic movies like From Dusk Till Dawn and Creepshow 2. And he's also even directed before. You might recognize the segment Inside the Closet from Tales from the Dark Side. Tom Savini directed that, and he directs a segment in this movie. So, on paper, it doesn't sound like a bad idea. But when you see this movie, and you see the budget, when you see the acting they were able to scrounge together for this, it's clear as day that no actual label wanted anything to do with this script because they didn't have faith in it, and it's completely micro budget, and it fits all the negative stereotypes that horror anthology films sadly run down into. And it's hard to defend a movie like this. It really is. But I do have some things about it that I do enjoy. And I feel like we should get into what this movie offers before we go any further on that. So, in this first movie, it kind of shows you what you're going to expect, I guess, out of the two films in question for this franchise. George Romero himself plays the narrator, and he is introducing the first segment in the beginning of the movie. He also provides the bridgeway between the first segment and the second segment and the third segment, and he also closes out the film. What is atypical for a horror anthology movie is that this one doesn't really have a wraparound. It's just a narrator sharing stories, which it's just George Romero telling you what Deadtime story is up next to, I guess, watch. And once we get through the whole spiel and what he, I guess, is trying to say in a spooky Vincent Pricean type of way, we get introduced to the first segment, which is Valley of the Shadows. Now, this one was written and directed by Jeff Monahan, and you'll see his name a couple times throughout the billing of this movie because he also acts as a main character in the next segment we're going to be talking about. But Valley of the Shadows, without a doubt, is one of the worst horror anthology segments ever made. From directing, from acting, from music usage, from atmosphere and setting, effects, you name it, it's fucking awful on every conceivable way. And I mean no offense to Jeff Monahan when I say this, but you should just stick to acting. You should really just stick to acting because holy shit, this was bad, man. Holy shit. This segment reminds me, if I had one giant comparison to compare this to, this reminds me of the worst segments from Creepshow 3, like The Haunted Dog and Alice. But imagine those segments if they looked and felt like a Cinemax After Dark porno movie. That's essentially this, just without the TNA and without the sex. So this story is about a woman who's trying to find her missing husband who has disappeared in the jungles of Africa. And her husband is after this wildflower, I guess, that has healing properties. It's never really explained, but it's just, I guess, an accent to the story to think about here. And the woman in the beginning of the story is even implied to be battered and injured at nighttime along the shoreline of some place, I guess, in the jungle somewhere. And we have to get caught up to speed on how she ended up here, right? She tells this story to this gentleman at this office desk. He appears to be a travel guide that's going to take on her husband's missing person case and take her along with a few other explorers to the coastline of Africa to help find her husband. And when they arrive in Africa, all hell breaks loose because apparently there's a bunch of cannibals that are local to the area and they are hunting these explorers because they have no idea, one, where they are at, and two, that these natives and cannibals don't want them there. And we see in the most cliche fashion and in terrible acting, mind you, one by one, these people get picked off in attempted to be creative ways, but the budget really does not fare well for these kills whatsoever, nor the blood effects. And it ends up to a point where the survivors have trickled down after, some close calls with being attacked and some people biting the dust. And we see that there's a part of this area where there's, decapitated heads on, spikes and what have you. And this is perhaps where these characters are going to end up by the end of the story. And it turns out, as predictable as that can be, that's essentially what happens. And I'll go no further because it's very easy to spoil the story. But I will say that it at least ties back to the setup that happens in the very beginning of the story. And we do see payoff to how this woman ended up in the situation that began it. So for that, it gets a mild pass there. But besides that, Valley of the Shadows, there was really nothing about this story that offered any substance. There was nothing about this story that offered anything that you couldn't get out of a better film or segment anywhere else that's kind of similar in subject matter. The closest thing this reminded me of was the Green Inferno by Adam Green. And that film, if you're trying to watch cannibal tribal people kill explorers and travelers, go watch that movie. Don't watch this piece of shit. I mean, this is just laughably bad. I mean, the acting is atrocious. The setting is backwoods Alabama, essentially. The native people that they've tried to pass off as Africans are just white dudes in paint. Yeah, it's that bad with it. The kills are, I guess, creative, but the gore looks so bad. And the actors do not help it whatsoever when they're trying to act in this blood, which looks like just Kool-Aid mixed with ketchup and the janky looking prosthetic work. They're making it worse almost every scene that has it in it. And the CGI, holy fuck, man. This was laughably bad. The twist has arguably some of the worst CGI I've ever seen in my life. And yeah, I mean, there's nothing here, nothing to really latch on to. I mean, it's all just an abhorrent Creepshow 3 bottom of the barrel level quality. But I would honestly say, and I can't believe I am saying this, that even the worst of Creepshow 3 doesn't get this low for me. I'd probably give this segment like a 0.5 out of 5 stars. And the only reason for that is because the ending ties back to the beginning. And I do kind of like the humor with it, but that's about it. Everything else can fucking burn in a dumpster. It was awful. Which leads me to the second segment. After we get the next spiel of George Romero, interstitialing the in between of the first and second segments, we get introduced to the story Wet. Now, this is the one directed by Michael Fisher, who was the director of Death Spa. And this one had a little more talent involved behind the camera, but then again, our main character is played by the director and the writer of Valley of the Shadows. And Jeff Monahan, who is that person, also wrote this entire movie and every story involved. So, yeah, yikes there. But anyways, this one I would say is also Creepshow 3 tier. But this is on the higher end of that for me. This kind of feels like the segments like Call Girl or The Radio that had potential, but it's held back by the talent and the budget. So this one probably had my best, or this one probably had my favorite premise in the whole film. This involves a drunken, town outcast who lives in a seaside community, and he's a scavenger. He essentially goes along the beach and the shoreline to collect things and to resell them and like repurpose them into art and what have you. And one fateful day, he comes across this weird object he finds in the sand. And shortly after he finds it, he starts to tell people what he thinks he's found. And one of the locals overhears him speaking about it and confronts him and says, "Hey, look, what you're finding, you do not want to find the remaining pieces of it." And what it ends up being is a potential, thought to be mythical creature known as a mermaid. But the man in his warning says that if these pieces are all put together, you ruin them being separated. And if you don't know anything about mermaid lore, which this segment kind of brings something cool to the table with, if a taken apart mermaid is reunited with her body, she can reanimate herself as like an undead vampire and come after you and drain your blood, and then she'll assume her natural form, which is even deadlier and scarier. So that's the premise of the story, and as predictable as it could follow, the guy does not listen to this man and decides to go find the remaining pieces of the mermaid, because in his mind he's thinking that, well, he can put her back together and he can prove that mermaids are real. But as you would expect, it backfires, and it leads up to the climax where this creature that he's reassembled after finding the remaining pieces of her that's been scattered all across the area reanimates and decides to come after him to drain his blood. And in a semi-respectable, gory fashion, kind of, we see what happens to the gentleman, and then we see the follow-up of the guy who gave this gentleman the warning, and perhaps whatever this thing that came to life is, and what that means by the end of it. So, yeah, Wet, I would say this story had some potential. I'm not going to say that this was the worst one, because I think Valley of the Shadows easily takes the cake. But then again, the acting here is not impressive. The music usage is still low budget. But there was some swings at some gore, and I will say that the effects of the creature weren't terrible. There, is the cliche moral of the story, right? That we've commonly seen with stories like Wet here, where you don't listen to the warnings being given to you and you try to bite the hand that feeds you, but the hand that feeds you ends up biting you back, and you end up getting accosted for it. This is, you reap what you sow. It's a typical cut and dry story. You've seen this done 1,000 times. Maybe not with this premise, and that's the sad thing. This premise could have been better executed with a higher budget, and maybe if this thing was in like Creepshow or something, they could have really pulled off something special here, and if they had better acting. But because this is a low budget / micro budget film, it really does show. And they had to cut a lot of corners. I mean, there are some things about the story itself that you kind of have to look past, especially in the final act, that are just, you have to kind of gloss over it and put some disbelief at the door with, but nothing too terrible there. But all said and done, as a package story, this was something with potential, but when you put it next to stuff that happened in Creepshow 3, for example, honestly, you can cut this segment out of the film and you can cut any segment that you want out of Creepshow 3 and you can paste it there. I don't think people would notice whatsoever that this is like pretty much equivalent to stuff that was in that movie. So yeah, I would probably give this segment here maybe like a 2 out of 5 stars, which is a meh. It's just a very meh story. Been there, done that with a lot of what it's trying to do, and the budget really doesn't help it. But if I was willing to be fairer on it, I can possibly bump it to a 2.25, but a 2 out of 5 is my ceiling because of how poorly acted and, you know, the lack of budget going on with the segment really does kind of weigh it down here. So, yeah, that's all I have to say about this one. So, moving on to, the final segment, of course, we have some more interstitial things with George Romero, and then we get introduced to the final segment, which is House Call. Now, this is the one directed by Tom Savini. And when I watched this segment, I got reminded of why I love Tales from the Dark Side's TV show when it was good. And this felt like a throwback to Tales from the Dark Side to the point where I kind of consider this an unofficially official Tales from the Dark Side segment in my head canon, and I'm fine with that. This story has a lot of similarities to segments that I've seen done in Tales from the Dark Side and Monsters, particularly with two. There's one segment from Tales from the Dark Side called Family Reunion, and there's another segment called The Moth. And if you kind of splice them together, this one feels like those segments put together, but with a lower budget. And sadly, there's not enough of a hook point here to make them stand out. And because the acting is kind of weaker than what you would want out of a segment like this, and the camera work can be shoddy because Tom Savini's working with lower budget cameras and what have you, this one isn't nearly as coveted as those 2 episodes from that show were for me. But nonetheless, this one's about a mom who has enlisted the help of this, I guess, doctor of sorts who, I guess, embraces the paranormal. And he has come to visit this woman's son who is locked in his room for unknown reasons. In this whole segment, I believe, is supposed to take place in like the 1920s or 30s, which is really cool. And but besides that, the woman tells the man these occurrences that have been going on with her son and how he's been acting strange for a week. And we see what happened to the family cat, which supposedly the son has been slowly draining the blood of throughout the week. And he has a specific reaction to sunlight and what have you. And the doctor seems to be, like listening, but not really. He's like, so what are you saying? Like, are you Are you believing in this conspiracy that vampires are real or something? Blah, 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 blah. And as the two are talking, the doctor's like, well, I do from time to time hear these cases that vampires or vampirism is riddling a family or what have you. So when I take these calls, I like to examine certain features that will give a dead giveaway that there is a vampire, but I want to make sure that they are a vampire before I proceed with my ruling of what to do. So he decides to go into the son's room and he is talking with the son and thinks that it would be a good idea if he takes the blood of him to examine it and see and maybe do some testing on it. And from that point, the story starts to get more interesting because the mom starts to get more paranoid and she starts to worry about the doctor being stuck in the room with her son for too long. And then it gets to a point where the doctor, he comes out of the room and he's like, all right, well, I got the blood sample. And the two of them are talking even further, but there's something that is looming. Like there's like a potential threat that they can't shake. And let's just say there comes a decision to be made by certain characters that something needs to be done about the son. And let's just say something happens to the son that involves, some typical vampire tropes, which leads to the follow up of said event where the two of them are discussing what just happened, and through the sorrow of it all, there's a recontextualization about the son and maybe this possible connection that the son has to this doctor that has visited this woman. And it kind of 180s the whole story into a bigger picture kind of thing. And there's perhaps more story that we didn't know about before that gets revealed to us. And I'll just leave it there because I don't want to spoil it. But yeah, House Call. This was a pretty decent story. I'm not gonna lie. It's very stage play in nature. It felt like a Tales from the Dark Side episode from start to finish. The acting wasn't terrible here. I think it was pretty serviceable. The atmosphere was pretty tense. Even though you kind of can see a lot of elements in the story coming, there is some themes in this story about, the mom wanting to do best for her son and try to cure her son. This is relatable stuff. I mean, some of my favorite Tales from the Dark Side episodes from back in the 1980s had this similar idea where you have this parent wanting to cure their children who have been stricken with this evil, but they have become evil, and now that they have to make a sacrifice to their hopes and dreams to do greater good for the rest of humanity. And that inflection really does work on the story. And the doctor element, I think, is a really cool addition. It kind of reminded me of a Monsters episode as well, now that I'm thinking about it, called The Fever Man, where the doctor comes to help this family who perhaps has this supernatural being living in their basement. This is kind of like that too with that character, but here, because of the twist, I think that it really does set this story apart from The Fever Man for me. And I like that the story ended on that recontextualization, which some people can probably argue that it was a very cheap, like left field kind of thing, which I totally get. But I think for as small of a scale of a story that it was, there's enough context there to kind of lead credence that this is believable. But I will say, my biggest negatives with this segment, of course, is the micro budget thing going on. There's an overusage of generic sound effects and what have you. The music, like all the other segments, isn't that good. And if I'm being honest, the camera work is very cheap, and it has probably the most annoying to look at motion effects in the whole movie. None of the other segments have that for some reason. But yeah. But Tom Savini, he brought something. He made the story stand out, and I can't be really too mad with it all. I'd probably give this segment realistically here. I'm not going to say that this is full on good, but this is pushing it. I think this is a decent horror anthology segment. I'd probably give this like a higher end of that at a 3.25 out of 5 stars though. But yeah, pretty solid stuff. And then of course, once the segment wraps up, we get caught up to speed on George Romero, and he ends off the movie and it fades to black, blah, 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 blah. So yeah, for a first time watch, I wasn't all too impressed with this movie. And if I'm being honest, it was a chore to sit through, and it was really hard to watch it at times. I will say the first segment was kind of like watching a car crash in motion. And then by the second segment, you just hit that wave of disappointment. And then by the third segment, you feel that brief excitement before it all fizzles out, before you can really enjoy it all. Which is a roller coaster of an experience, but that's honestly how I felt with this movie. On the whole, the segments are nothing too remarkable. There's plenty of other stories that do what these segments do, but better. But I will say I didn't hate it as much as I thought I would, which is shocking. Like I keep comparing this to Creepshow 3, but I think I should end this review portion off with something that people have notoriously said about Tales from the Dark Side, the movie, right? And people have said for years that Tales from the Dark Side, the movie, is the real Creepshow 3 because Creepshow 3 is so bad. I'm willing to argue that the real Creepshow 3, the one that we got in 2006, is actually Deadtime Stories Volume 3. Because this string of horror anthology films for George Romero from Creepshow 3, even though he was not involved whatsoever there, he did put his beloved Creepshow IP in jeopardy by trusting those individuals, so he indirectly is involved with that movie. he's more directly involved with Deadtime Stories Volume 1 and Volume 2, right? But Creepshow 3 really does feel like these movies more than Creepshow. In Deadtime Stories, maybe in an alternate life, this film could have had a higher budget, better talent, and it could have helped make some of these stories pop and not been as terrible as they were. But because of the circumstances, this is not a good movie. This is not a good horror anthology movie. This is not a great George Romero entry ever. And I would be at a hard confident to say that this possibly is in the running with the worst movie George Romero had ever put his name attached to, which is saying a lot because I've seen some George Romero movies that I think are absolutely atrocious. But given it all, um, this is not a must watch movie by any means, but I didn't hate it. And if I ever find this at like a Goodwill or maybe like a flea market or something for $1, I might pick it up. I'll probably give this a 1.75 out of 5 stars. It's a bad movie as a whole, but there are some things about it that aren't hateable. Like Creepshow 3, I'd give a 1 out of 5 stars. I haven't seen Volume 2 here, so I don't know how high I would rate that movie. It can't be too far off from this, but a 1.75 out of 5 stars is my ceiling for this tier of anthology movie. And at least it has that going for it. I've seen way worse micro budget horror anthology movies, surprisingly enough, and I'll probably cover them in this playlist sooner than later because holy shit, there are some that definitely need a roasting. But yeah, this one is mostly inoffensive, minus the first segment being very questionable and borderline, racist. But that aside, yeah, that's all I really have to say about this movie. So that's my thoughts on George Romero's Deadtime Stories Volume 1. Let me know down in the comment section if you've seen this movie before. What's your thoughts on the segments? What's your favorite? What's your least favorite? Have you seen Volume 2? What's your thoughts on those segments? Did you like this movie more than Creepshow 3? Let me know down in the comment section and keep the discussion going. Until next time, stay spooky. Take care.